right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen here and start the slides. So I've got a bunch of slides, and then, so I'm going to go through those. I will stop at a few places to just stop the slides and check in with the chat, or see if there are folks who have comments or, you know, questions or whatever. If you want to leave your picture off while I'm talking, while I'm presenting with the slides, feel free to do that. What I'd like is that if we come back together for questions and things, that you turn your video on then. So I have learned that in most Zoom meetings I'm in now, I'm much less fatigued at the end if I hide my self view. And so I know that, you know, having your video on can be stressful. So it's fine. Turn it off while I'm on the slides. But when we stop to have some conversations, then it'd be great if you would turn it back on again, if we could have that agreement. So I'm here to talk about retrospectives in the enterprise. And I think what may surprise a lot of you is it's not all that different. but I'm gonna talk about how that works and how it can be different as we go along. And then of course I know you'll have a lot more questions about that at the end. So for some of you, this is just going to be a refresher about retrospectives. Others, it'll, you know, there'll be some new information here. So we'll just, you know, wherever you're at with this, I think you'll find your good new information for what you need. So a little bit about me. I've been in the organization development, team development, work process redesign since the mid 80s and early 90s. And I joined the kind of Agile community through the extreme programming door. So before the Agile Manifesto was written, I was already interacting with some of the extreme programming folks. And so I've been in the community since the very late 90s, early 2000s. And what I learned there was I had the opportunity to take some of the things I had learned from my previous work process design and team development work and contribute that back into the Agile community. So I've written a few books, I've created a couple of models, and today we're going to be focusing mostly on the Agile Retrospectives book and a bit on this quick start guide for the 5 rules of accelerated learning. We can talk about the other models. I'll reference the Agile Fluency model kind of in passing, but we're not really going to dive deep there. So I am assuming that you are either an organizational leader, Agile coach, you know, Agile consultant, maybe, since you're interested in the enterprise, and that you are as committed, or maybe almost as committed as I am, to organizational learning, by which I mean people learning in groups. And so that can be everything from a work group, a team, up to a division and bigger. And it can be at any place in the organization. It could be leadership teams learning for improvement. It could be frontline teams. It could be teams of managers, cross-functional teams. You know, that's who I believe I'm talking to today. So if you're, you know, if that doesn't ring your chime, you may or may not be interested in the rest of the things I have to say. But for me, that's been my life work. And so that's when when Ron contacted me and I talked with Jay and the other folks, was my assumption. So that's who I am directing this to. So my agenda, our learning journey we're going to do today is we'll start out and talk about why retrospectives, and, you know, then why in the enterprise. We'll go through the framework for Agile retrospectives. we'll look at some issues around team learning, because retrospectives are about learning. If you're not interested in learning, then there's no point in learning about retrospectives. If you're doing retrospectives, as some people still do, to check off a checklist box, then in my view, you're doing something other than what I would call a retrospective. So we'll talk about that for a minute. And so learning is really important. And then I'll close with talking a little bit about designing enterprise retrospectives and how that might be different. So we start with the manifesto for Agile software development. Principle 12. At regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. I really love that principles page for the manifesto, because it is the descriptor. I mean, the values are great, but the real descriptions of what you see in organizations are often the most helpful.
Please.
And so we look at the principle, and there were a bunch of us. After Norm Kurth published his book, there were a bunch of us who were really interested in doing retrospectives, who got together. And this is like I guess this was like 2000. His book came out in 1999. And we got together and we were talking about, talking about the manifesto and so on. And a lot of the folks were saying, well, there's this principle 12, but there's no, other than in Crystal, where Alistair Coburn talked a little bit about reflection sessions, none of the methodologies had anything about how to implement principle 12. So so that's when Esther and I got together, and a lot of folks started writing about at that time and contributing, so that we could actually have some practices to wrap around this principle. So point of retrospectives is continuous improvement. And so I went to the American Society for Quality for a definition of, what is continuous improvement? So it's ongoing. It's an ongoing effort, improvement across a lot of areas in products, services, processes, teamwork, customer relationships, inter-organizational relationships, seeking incremental improvement over time, or breakthrough improvement all at once. And so with that over time and the all at once, they were referencing back to Lean with the ideas of Kaizen and Kaikaku. So, but to get to continuous improvement, you have to do continuous learning. And so it's what supports continuous improvement. And so from the businessdictionary.com, I found an ongoing learning process that seeks to incorporate lessons learned from the results of already implemented changes or experiments into a continuous improvement program. So this is kind of the three legs of this, is holding the retrospective session, focusing, finding ways to do continuous learning, and finding ways to point that at continuous improvement. And those together really create retrospectives, which is a focused examination in the present, during which the group of people inspect and learn from the past. And, it could be their immediate past or a longer term past, in order to influence and adapt future teamwork methods, processes, and practices. So the idea is, if the retrospective is not creating some way of influencing the future through learning and an improvement focus, it's not doing its job. And so we want to make sure that that's what's going on there. So, why do retrospectives? Why do Agile retrospectives? Well, in that group of folks, which ended up morphing into something we called the Retrospective Facilitators Gathering over time. It's still going on. I think the first one is in 2002, and they still happen every year. This year's was a little weird, but different folks have done research and collected information about when retrospectives are done well, what's the benefit? What do organizations get from that? And what they have found is increased productivity, increased capacity for work, increased capability and knowledge transfer between and among team members. Product and service quality is better. People have better collaboration skills that they can apply elsewhere in the organization. And morale and psychological safety gets better and stronger, and of course psychological safety leads to overall success and better cross-organizational working relationships, particularly when we're talking about doing retrospectives that aren't just focused in a team, but that are being done across the organization. So you might have retrospectives at different kinds of times for different purposes. When folks are doing, say, mob programming these days, or working on intense efforts, collective efforts, they may hold something like Pomodoros, you know, have a retrospective every 25 minutes or every second Pomodoro. I know lots of folks in the mob programming world, ensemble programming world, who are doing that. They also often do daily retrospectives. How do we improve when we reflect on today? How do we make things better for tomorrow? So that happens. And then, of course, the thing we're most familiar with is the iteration or sprint, or with Kanban, sometimes it's a cadence that they pick, that they do their retrospectives. But then there's also things like overview retrospectives or reset retrospectives. Things aren't going the way we want. Let's stop and sort of look over a longer term and figure out what's tripping us up and what that tells us about what we might want to do differently in the future. And then there are release retrospectives, there's end of project or end of delivery retrospectives, and of course, surprise retrospectives that happen when something in the environment changes that none of us expected, and we need to get our grounding under us reestablished. That's a great time to do a retrospective, and in a team or organization-wide. So when we think about enterprise, so that was all just sort of retrospectives in general. When we think about enterprise retrospectives, what you may or may not be aware of is that there already has been a lot of things have been published in this area. So coming from the complex adaptive systems point of view, and published by the Stanford University Press, is Glendo Yang and Royce Holliday's Adaptive Action, Leveraging Uncertainty in Your Organization. If you read that book, and I'm going to talk about it a little more later, you'll notice that it is the core of a retrospective. But they're doing it across the organization to create and influence the direction of change that's happening there. And then a number of years ago, Jutta Eckstein, who's like one of our most prolific contributors in the Agile space, wrote a book called Retrospectives for Organizational Change, where she's actually looking at using retrospectives more at the enterprise level than just at the team level. And Norm Kurth, when he wrote his book, The Project Retrospectives, a Handbook for Team Reviews, he was really looking at, he was looking at end of project retrospectives. Agile wasn't really around yet then. He was looking at projects that had been going on for a couple of years that might have several hundred contributors, and how at the end of that could we look back across that experience and influence future projects that we would do in our organization. And so that was not at the team level. It was at a much higher level. So his book really is focused on that, but it is focused on product development as a project. right? So we can also think then beyond that. So Jesper Boig has a book called Level Up Agile with Toyota Kata. Toyota Kata is not the same format as the Agile retrospectives that we're going to talk about, but it can be very useful. And because it's helpful to kind of mix things up, you don't want to be doing the same old retro all the time. People get bored with that, and particularly now that we're taking everything online, we need to create more sparks and joy. So there are times when you might want to switch it up and do a Toyota Kata retrospective. And so so Jesper has written about that. And then finally, Madhavi Lidala, who's one of our colleagues from India, has written a great little book called Retrospectives for Everyone, Powerful Metaphors for Effective Retrospectives. And she has outlined, I can't even remember, I wrote a foreword for her book, but I don't remember how many metaphors that you can use in a retrospective to help people think differently about the work that they are reflecting on, and that can often bring out different insights by, you know, thinking of it as a group mountain climbing trip versus a trip on a train or a sailboat or whatever. Sailboat, a lot of people are familiar with, but she's got a lot of other ones in that book, and it's very fun. So the real work that happens in retrospectives is work of reflecting, learning from those reflections, thinking about what the meaning of those reflections might be, making some decisions based on that, and then moving into action together, collectively. So that really is the work that we're looking to do in a retrospective, because we want to reflect the sort of decision-making, action choosing process that goes on in each of us as humans individually, right? But then be able to do that in a group setting. So when we individually notice something that isn't maybe working the way we want, although appreciative retrospectives are great too, but let's just stick with we need to improve things here, right? Well, so as humans, we notice that there's something we want to improve. I don't like it when my cup sits over here. I want my cup to be right here in front of me, right? I notice that, right? So I notice my cup, and then I learn about, well, what is it? How heavy is that cup? Do I really want it sitting over there? What's going on with this cup? I learn about how heavy is this cup. I learned something about the cup, right? Think about it. I decide, I really rather have it over here. I move it into action, and then I, go forward. Well, we want that same process to happen in our retrospectives for the whole group. But in order to do that, we have to bring some group process activities to it to make that work, because people aren't going to just mind meld and do all that together. Otherwise, people are moving at different, some people are reflecting while other people have already done all the analysis they want to do. They're ready to decide. And very often, groups of people assume that you don't have to do all of these things. But you do. And one of the things we've noticed is that business people very often just want to move into action. They want to decide and move into action. Where like software engineers and those kinds of folks just want to think. They just want to analyze it. They just want to think about it. And they don't really take time to reflect and make sure everybody's thinking about the same thing. And they don't really feel a need to necessarily move into action, which is how we get retrospectives that are lists of things. Here's what worked well. Here's what we'd like to do differently. Here's something else. And then we say, okay, we've got our lists. Now the retrospective is done. That's a hugely common pattern in the Agile world. but it never moves into action. We just assume that by having the list, that will somehow cause the change, and it doesn't. We need all of these steps, and we need the group to move through all of these steps together. So Esther and I created this, what we call a flexible, scalable framework. This is a framework that you can use at any time frame to look at almost any event. And oops, back. So we're going to talk about it and hear a little more in a minute, but set the stage, gather data, generate insights, decide what to do, close the retrospective. So let's move, we'll move into that a little bit more in a minute. But so, and for those of you who are Agile Fluency fans, in our blog, on our website, there are three posts, and each one focusing on, or each one describing and paying attention to what might be the focus that you would choose, or the ideas that you want to center your retrospective around, depending on what zone your team is in. But that's more for delivery teams. So I'm going to keep moving on. So flexible, scalable framework. The key here is this inner part: the gather data, generate insights, decide what to do. Gather data is that reflecting and learning. Generate insights is learning and thinking. Deciding what to do is deciding and moving into action, right? And so that we want to move the team through that. And because when Esther and I wrote the book, because we knew that a lot of people who would be faced with needing to lead retrospectives would not necessarily have a lot of facilitation skills or background in facilitation, we added some advice around when you get people together, first kind of set the stage and help them understand why they're together. And then when you get to the end, make sure you tie things up so that people can easily move out of the retrospective session into the next work that they need to do. But this center of gather data, generate insights, and decide what to do is where the real work happens. And we call that, it is also called adaptive action. And that comes from this adaptive action learning, which is rapid cycles of data collection, meaning making, trial, and repeat, right? What? Gather data, data collection, meaning making. So what? Generate insights out of that. Now what? Decide what you're going to do and move into action, and then keep that cycle going. And so that comes from this book, Adaptive Action, and that was published out of Stanford University Press. And if you want to really dive into like the research behind this and that sort of thing, this is the book to look at. But what goes on in the middle of a retrospective is very reflective of what gets described in this book as a way to influence and guide and nurture and create the kinds of responses to uncertainty and change that you want to create in your organization. Learning leads to change. Once we learn something new, once we ask a question and we begin learning about that question, we can never go back to being the people who don't have that knowledge or that skill that we learned, right? And then once we realize we change, we often notice new things that we need to learn. And so this learning and change cycle is the sort of the bigger piece of what's going on here in the retrospective. So I'm going to stop there actually for a moment, and here, let's do that. Stop there. And let's take a minute and talk about just that part. Like, what is a retrospective? Why do you want to do it? how do you begin to think about moving groups through, and what's some of your experience been with enterprises in needing to do that work? So if somebody who's been sort of monitoring the chat can, if there's anything there that we need to pay attention to, if there's anyone who wants to just call out a question, that'd be great.
Yeah, I don't see anything, this Jay, in here, but if anyone just wants to call out and unmute and
Yeah.
go ahead.
Hey, Diana, I will ask a question. This is Gopal. The question I have is, you talked about the retrospectives in terms of, we do the retrospectives, there is a list of things that come out of it, right?
Yeah.
In terms of list of things we need to do. And then you talked about this feedback loop, the adaptive action, which is the gather data, insights, and decide what to do for each one of those things.
Yeah.
You know, if we have, let's say, in a big enterprise, we probably have at least a dozen or 2 dozen different teams working on things. And you're talking about each one of them generating this. So how do we, you know, do you have any best practices or any guidance in terms of how do we track these things for adaptive action so that we don't get lost? First of all, the forest for the trees. And the second thing is not fall anything through the cracks.
Right. So, well, the thing about I was just talking to somebody yesterday who was telling me about some very ancient ways of decision making in new situations when we want things to happen. And they were talking about these little bones that come out of your wrist in every animal. So every animal that gets used for food generates one of these, and that they would use those as a kind of a guidance for what was coming next. And what I loved about the description was that there were really only 2 kinds of guidance. It was try again or proceed. So you know you're not quite there where you want to be yet, so try again. Okay, you're there yet. Okay, now go forward, right? What was interesting to me about that was it was a never-ending cycle of moving forward in some way, either trying again or proceeding to the next step, right? And really, that's the world we're in. There is always something new to do. There is always going to be the next thing. There is never, we're never going to be done, right? I mean, you only have to look at this year to figure that out. We're never going to be done. And so when you're in the enterprise and you've got different groups at different levels who are focused on this, their viewpoint is also different. So they are going to be coming up with things. And if you're doing this on a regular cycle, you are going to pick up very quickly on the things that that group is doing that's getting in our way, and the things we're doing who are getting in somebody else's way, and that generates some conversations and some new awareness of new learning of what we really want to do if we want to accomplish our continuous improvement. So it's not like any of these things can happen in isolation, and people need to be able to take action in their purview. It's like, you know, the Lean and the Toyota production system talk about every decision needs to be made closest to the work that it affects, right? So I would expect the executive team to be making decisions about making strategic decisions and broader business direction decisions. And I would expect the software teams to be making decisions about how they are going to get the product to market as quickly as they can, and then maybe needing to work with the marketing folks or somebody else to be able to do that. But there is, you know, when we think about organizations, it is a collection of nested and disparate systems. right? It's a big system that has its parts are systems, and each of those systems has parts. And so negotiating how that happens becomes a part of the process. And also there was something else that you said, Gopal, in the beginning about people doing a retrospective and coming out with all these big lists of things that they want to address. One or two things, but on a more rapid cycle. Not a long list of things, ever, because we can't keep track. So we pick the one or two things that are most accessible to us, that we think we can be successful at, that will help us move forward, and we only do one or two things per retrospective. And if all the groups are only doing that till they cycle back around to their next retrospective, they're much less likely to trip over each other. And they're much more likely to be checking in.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes, I actually, in teams, I often recommend that at the end of the retrospective, they actually write their action item on a card and take that with them into sprint planning or iteration planning, or whatever that group is doing. So let's continue from here. I'm going to take us on a quick ride through a retrospective. Play. All right. So the first part of a retrospective, we want to do what we call set the stage, which means get everybody present in the room, get their minds present in the room to do the work, right? And so we would, for instance, share an agenda. This was an agenda for an Agile working group sprint. It was early on, and they were like, we wanted to collect everybody's experience to figure out where they were headed. So this is typical. This is it is the agenda. It says, we've thought about this, we've made some plans for this, we're not going to waste your time, we're coming together. It's got a focus. We're not trying to boil the ocean. We're just going to look at this one piece that is affecting us as a group. And then there is the steps that we're going to go through, the things that we will look at as we're moving through. And you can see here, when I did this one, I checked off each one as we did them. So people knew there was transparency about how the process was moving forward. So always having that. What I'd like to do is just ask you at this point, what's one place, one enterprise situation or company or thing where you either thought it might be a good idea to use a retrospective, or you, looking back, you think, you might have wanted to use a retrospective there, that you either did use one or you kind of wanted to and weren't able to move that forward. So let's use the chat or just speak out for that. Where's some place where you said, I wonder if a retrospective would work right here, when you felt like you were working in the enterprise space? This is where I'm going to use my good facilitator skills of staying silent until some people speak up. You'd be amazed how long I can wait this out. Who has some examples?
Hi, this is Andrew.
Hi, Andrew.
I would say overall, in my experience, we definitely should have more of them. And what really resonated with something you said earlier was how management tends to be in the deciding, moving to action phase. Mm-hmm. That is a very difficult hurdle to get over.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to, you know, especially when people are trying to race along at 100 miles an hour,
Yeah.
to, you know, even dream of doing something like thinking, much less reflecting.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. But there are lots of instances, right? If you're working at an enterprise level, you're working with the managers, the leaders in the organization, you're the things that you are trying to influence are going to have broad implications across the company, across the business. You know, you need those better decision making tools, right? Yeah. Competitor disruption. Yeah, that's a good, that's, you know, when folks are going, oh my God, they're going to eat our lunch. What are we going to do? It's a great time for a retrospective. Another time when I've talked with folks who were doing that was when the bigger part of the organization had made a choice to move some of their product lines offshore. And the teams that were working on those product lines were going to be redistributed. So the teams are being broken up and their work was moving offshore. A very wise retrospective facilitator, Linda Rising, took that on and helped to lead a retrospective that helped figure out how the transfer of knowledge was going to happen and how the team members were going to stay in touch as they moved into other assignments during the in the organization. And it was a great retrospective. She tells a great story about that. So lots of times, lots of different things come up where reflecting on what we've done and thinking of learning from that and thinking about how we want to move forward is super useful. So, all right, let's go back here. So I hope you all did that at least as a thought experiment. So what this was is a one-word check-in. At the beginning of a retrospective, you want to get people focused on the problem. So you ask a question that pulls their attention to the thing that you want to focus on. In this instance, enterprise retrospectives. So often I do something at the beginning of a retrospective. I'm actually doing some work, some study now on the idea of how retrospectives can help us move into a less blaming kind of culture in our organizations. And one of the ways to do that is retrospective prime directive. Other folks will do some kind of safety check at the beginning of a retrospective, but I often use this. This is from Norm Kurth's Project Retrospectives book. Regardless of what we discover, we understand and truly believe that everyone did the best job they could given, right? Maybe not their independent standard of best, but in that moment, it was the best they could manage, because we are always being affected by other things around us. So did they have the information they needed? Were their skills and abilities a good match for the job they were given to do? Did they have the right resources, all kinds of support? Did they have permissions to make decisions and so on? And what else was the situation of hand? Did they show up with a cold that day? Was the outdoor smoky? Were they already dumped into working online when they had no experience doing that before? So what is the context and constraints? And if we can do that, if we can move off of thinking about the people not doing a good enough job, which can happen, but it's not because they didn't show up to do the best job. It's that these other things were happening in our system. So we go to systems thinking. We think in terms of the system, and that helps to create safety in the organization. There will be no blame. There will be no judging in this retrospective. We are going to investigate why anybody's job wasn't adequate to what happened, right? If that is the case. So once we've got some of those things out of the way, we've set the stage, people are ready to move forward working together into the retrospective. So now we're going to do some gathering of data. Things like this FRIM chart over here on the left, that is a impact, positive impact to negative impact on our work. And across the bottom is frequency, which is FRIM. I'm terrible at naming activities, but it's not my sweet spot. Let's just put it that way. But anyway, so this is called FRIM, and there it's frequency and impact. So we have people write on sticky notes things that happened over the course of the period of time that we're looking at, and then they place them on a grid according to, did that have a good impact on the team and our work together? Did it have a bad impact on the team or our work together? And then how often did it happen? And then we can begin to look at those, like, so what, if you look at this particular FRIM, you know, think about what you see there. How would you unpack that? I generally start in the top right corner and then I go to the bottom left corner. And then we work through the rest of it, because I want to see the things that are happening a lot that are really helping us, because we don't want to lose any of those things. But then I also want to see the things that might happen that could be catastrophic for us. So we want to look for that. Another tool that we use here is a timeline. And here we look at the effort and where we place. I just put then and now on here. I created this on a Miro board. It's pretty easy to do remotely. Usually instead of then and now, it would actually be cut into time increments. So first week, second week, third week, now, whatever, you know, whatever is the appropriate one. And then we put a scale, y-axis on this, that is how proud or sorry were we about that thing that happened. So again, they make the sticky notes ahead of time and then put it on the board, right? So once we have this data, then, and you'll notice, oh, here's an enterprise retrospective, a picture of an enterprise retrospective that I led at one point. And each of these table groups were a part of an enormous release that was going out. There was the marketing team was here, several development teams, there was product development folks, there were just everybody who was involved. And each table group did a timeline on a long piece of paper. So you can see the differences in the colors of sticky notes up there. And then we layered those timelines one above the other. And to look at, we could look at chronological slices and say what was going on with your team, what was going on with your team, and how did that accumulation influence the whole group. So there are lots of different ways of using some of these tools whether you're talking about using them with a big group or with a single team or so on. We also had a lot of fun with this one. We did a lot of layering on it, and we looked at it from the point of view of once we had the original timelines up, we looked at it from which of these things that happened in your section, in your timeline, might have affected things in the other timelines. And we gave people string to connect those things together. And then we gave them little stickers that had smiley faces, and they had Band-Aids and various things. So they annotated the whole thing. So it was very rich by the time they had finished creating this whole thing. So another thing I like to do once I have that collection of data, however I've collected it, is use these things called pattern spotter questions, which are a more systems way of looking at things. And it also comes from the Human Systems Dynamic Institute. So we look at one of those charts that we've created and we say, and I usually have people like step way across the room, or, you know, if it's online, it's a little bit easier. I can zoom out from it and say, okay, if we just look at it, we just look at the patterns that are here, what do we notice? And so what are the generalities we can pull out of this? And where are the exceptions to those generalities? Where are the contradictions that show up in this data? What are we surprised by? What happened that nobody expected? And what still is puzzling or what do we still not understand that was going on here? So we do that from stepping way back, and then we go up closer to the data, however we've collected it, and look at more at the detail view, just like looking at the detail of a painting. We zoom in on one part of it and say, what's going on here and what does that tell us and what is the detail? And when we've done that, we've really gathered the data and created a shared understanding of the data among the group. Otherwise, if we don't do this, everybody shows up with their own experience of what happens, and they're all speaking from their own experience, and there is no common idea of what really that experience was. That's why gathering data is so important, so that we're at least working with the same data. So once we have that, then we move to the generating insights. One of the things I really like to use is this circles and soup activity, where we get actions, or we get issues, we put them on whether the team controls them, whether the team can influence those issues, whether the team has no influence over those issues. It's just something that happens the team has to deal with, which we call the soup. And then we look at those issues and we say, for the ones the team controls, where can we take direct action? That's within our control. We can decide what we want to do there, right? That's usually, it's one way to sort of really figure out where to help a team get started on their improvement journey, is with the things that they actually can control. But eventually you get to those things that the team needs to influence, where things that are happening outside of the team, but that are getting in their way. And so the actions that the team needs to take there are persuading actions or recommending actions. So once we understand the issues, we can move on to think about, well, what kinds of actions could we take there? And then finally, in the soup, where we don't have any control or influence, we can change our own response as a team. And so we can look at how might we shift the way we respond when this happens, and will that help us improve? So that's one way of generating some insights. There's lots of others. This is what it looks like when when it's done with sticky notes. Gets kind of crazy, but it's fun. And then there's also an online version at GameStorm.com. So if you're needing, as we all are, needing to do things remotely, that can be a really helpful way to go about that. Also, liberating structures. I assume a lot of you are familiar with the idea about liberating structures and ways of generating ideas. So what we're doing here is trying to find the insights in that data that we gathered, and then generate some possibilities. What might we do? Because we're not at the deciding yet, but we want multiple ideas of what we could do going forward, so that we have a rich basis to choose from when we actually decide on our next action. And so then we move to decide what to do. And there are a couple of things here. I love when I did a large scale retrospective with a military installation that was a data gathering kind of military installation, and there were a number of different groups who needed to work together, and they brought me in to do quite a large retrospective with them. I think we had 30 or 40 people in the room for that one, and they came from 5 or 6 different groups, so the different perspectives that showed up. So one of the things we did there was we got to a place where we could look at our decisions creating 15% solutions. So we had done the data gathering, we had done generating the insights, and then we were moving into this decision, and we knew we couldn't boil the ocean. So what were the small actions that they could take that would help them with that? So this 15%, I think we did a 20% solution or something with that group. But I mean, you can scale, you can do 10%, you know, this is just for example. Another way that we do that, if the team has been, or if the group has been pretty focused on, hey, these are the ideas that we want to go after, and they're already clear about that, then a way to get them to decide which one that they want to move forward is this EIEIC, which stands for Ideas, Effort, Impact, Energy, and Commitment. And on this one, you can see we did it on put some flip chart paper up on a whiteboard. And they really only had 3 ways forward that they were interested in pursuing, but they needed to choose among them. So we put them up there, and then we had people do dot voting for, well, how much effort will this take? Sometimes I just have people do t-shirt sizing here. Is this a small, medium, large, extra large? But in this one, we did dot voting. And then we talk about impact. We don't talk about importance, we talk about impact. Which of these would have the greatest beneficial impact? And then of course everybody has some dots, and they use those dots according to where they think they'll get the most impact. And then the 4th column is the really critical one. It's energy. It's, well, what do we really have the energy to go after? Where is our enthusiasm taking us? Where is our group focus? And in this one, it was pretty clear. Even though effort was all over the place, impact was pretty even, it was very clear which one they most wanted to do. And that was the that top one. And so rather than going through a big decision-making process, it was just there. It was apparent. Oh, well, this is the one we're going to do because this is the one we want to do, right? This is the one we're most likely to follow through on. And so then we asked, and because we know there's a lot of energy and enthusiasm for going after that improvement action, it's easy to find somebody who will take on that commitment and make sure that the whole group follows through on it. And so in this one, we had one person, I think it was Dick, stepped up and said, I'll make sure this follows through. And then we had, I can't read that name, Heather and Julia, I guess, who would support him. If something happened to him, we wanted a backup plan. If something were to happen and he were to get sick or for some reason could not follow through, we wanted to already have a backup plan. We didn't want to have to scramble around and find that later. So that was that one. And then finally we come, so now we've got our action. We know what we're going to move forward with. We know what that's going to be. And now it's time to close the retrospective. So in closing the retrospective, we thank the group for the work that they have put in. We generally do some kind of debrief on our feedback on how did the retrospective go for them. Was this ROTI scale is in the Agile Retrospectives book. It's been a workhorse for everybody. Was it a big waste of time? Did we feel like we got a good amount of value out of this session for the amount of time we put into it? Or did we get a lot of value, a lot more value than if we had spent our time doing something else? So there you can see an analog one and then a virtual one. It's another Miro It's in the Miro sandbox. And then people can just pull these dots, whatever dot they like to use, can pull those over and place them on there. And then you see overall, how did people react to the session? Another way of getting feedback on the session is to do a retrospective on the retrospective. It's really a debrief. It's not really a retrospective, but a lot of people like to call it that. So when we think about our retrospective, is there anything we're sorry about? What are we proud about that we did in our retrospective? What ideas do we have for next time? And do we have appreciations for each other for how we interacted in our retrospective? Kind of helps that. The first one, the ROTI, tends to focus most on how the retrospective facilitator can improve. This one focuses more on how the whole team regards how they worked together on the retrospective. So then that's the end. Whether we tie that up with a bow, like Jay said, write the action item on an index card or something, have some way of transmitting that into the next planning session if it's a software team or they're doing that, but some way of keeping that improvement action alive. We need to have that figured out before we close. So what we want to do is make sure we have some way of sustaining the learning and the improvement actions that we want to do. So we talk about that. We have that built into the ongoing efforts that we have. So after the retrospective, when we're moving back into the work, we need to still be thinking about how are we going to incorporate those improvements in what we do. It's one of the reasons that why a lot of my friends who are doing ensemble programming or mob programming do very frequent retrospectives because they apply that immediately. So it's, as Woody calls it, turning up the good, right? So we've done 2 25-minute Pomodoros. We're going to do a 3-minute retrospective. What just happened? Is there anything we want to do differently in our next chunks of work? But first, what just happened? What do we notice happened? We can do that very quickly. Did anybody notice something that they wish had gone some other way? What do we want to do about that? Okay, let's do whatever we need to do to incorporate that, and then we take the rest of our Pomodoro break and go into the next piece of work. So you could do that on a very small scale. You can do it on a very large scale. I once led the retrospective for the back when Sun Microsystems was still a thing. I led the retrospective on the Java 2E project, which was a 2-year effort that had 300 people involved over the course of time. We took a slice of all the different perspectives that were involved in that and invited 75 people to the retrospective. And we also did a bunch of interviewing that we gathered as data to bring into the retrospective. And that was a couple of days that we spent on that one. So, it depends. Well, here, we'll just talk about this. Actually, well, I'm going to do this first. So the point of this is that we really need to sustain the learning. And Willem Larsen and I have written a book called The 5 Rules for Accelerated Learning. And what we have found over time is that if you pay attention to these 5 things, you create a much better environment for learning, whether it's individual learning, small group learning, organizational learning, learning on any scale. These 5 rules can help you ensure that the learning happens, which can then ensure that you have all the ideas you need, the insights you need for your improvement actions, and can move those forward. So first thing is keep it alive. That has to do with remembering that there are humans involved here and that we need to recognize the needs, the physiological and psychological needs that humans have when we're in this learning environment. The setting needs to come first. We need to figure out how we're going to create a climate for learning, whether that's a physical setting or a virtual setting online. You'll notice that I've set up this these slides with a black background. So there's not so much distraction between a big white square and then the black Zoom and then what else is going on. So it helps people focus. That was a setting first choice that I made. Do it for real. Keep the learning as close as possible to real work. We want to make sure that if we're learning about tools, we want to use the real tools and so on. Start obvious, stay obvious. No fooling around. We want to stay focused or keep our attention on what we're doing here and not playing games. So for instance, in retrospectives, I never, beyond rarely, I never suggest that you set the stage by using icebreakers. You set the stage by doing some fun and interesting things, but they are focused on the work. It's not some random, what color of ice cream are you? Right? Because that distracts, right? We want to start obvious and stay obvious. This is the focus of this retrospective, and everything we do in this retrospective is going to be pointed toward this focus. And then finally, focus on flow, which has to do with sizing and sequencing the learning that we're doing, which is another reason why I say we've got to focus, we've decided what that is, and we're only looking for maybe 2 small or 1 larger improvement effort to come out of this. Because we can take that in as a team. It's not going to come up against all the other work we need to do. And we can then incorporate it with the last thing that we did, and it'll be easy to incorporate the next thing. It's integrated as it goes along. So why is this stuck? Oh, there we go. Okay. So one of the things I do is I have that, keep it alive. I use my fingers, keep it alive, set the stage, setting first, do it for real. Start obvious, stay obvious, and focus on flow. And this is my mnemonic device for that. So wherever I show up to do any kind of teaching or facilitate any kind of session where people need to learn, I've always got that in mind. So the questions I ask myself is, keep it alive. How can I create more aliveness here? How can I create more aliveness here? How can I make my setting more conducive to the learning? How can we get closer to doing this for real? I really worked at trying to figure out how in this session we could actually do an enterprise retrospective as a part of this session, and it overcame me. I wasn't able to do it nearly as much as I wanted because I wanted to get closer to doing it for real. And then how can I make the learning more obvious here? And how do I size and sequence the learning for flow? So those are the important ones. And I think I'm going to stop there again before we move on to the next piece. All right. So that was a trip through holding a retrospective, going through the 5 parts of a retrospective framework. So what questions and comments do we have for that?
Diana, the example you were giving with Sun, could you give us some more detail on how, so you're bringing 75 people into
75 people.
Truly an enterprise level.
Yes, it was very much an enterprise.
You said you did some interviewing beforehand. You brought that.
Yeah.
Can you give us a little sense of the flow of how that went and what you did? And
absolutely. Yeah, it was a huge effort, obviously. That was in 2003. So people have been doing enterprise retrospectives for a long time. Java 2E, it was before, while Sun was still extant, right? It was like, then they were, I mean, since they're not around anymore, I guess I can talk about them a little bit. They were struggling with Oracle and, you know, some of their customers, and how were they getting people to use their products and so on. And so this is a really important retrospective. And I worked with the product manager, the program manager, and a group of other people that we brought together. So we formed a group that prepared together for this retrospective. And we did, between us, we collected probably 50 interviews. We each did 5 or 10 interviews with people who weren't going to be able to be at the retrospective. So we identified who all was going to be there and who could come. And then we looked at whose perspective do we also want a lot. And we went out and interviewed those folks, and then we did factor analysis on the interviews and chunked that down so that we could then feed that back to the group. We also went to the quality, the cute, what's the name of that place that's in Boston? I'm blanking on his name. I can see his face, but I don't know his name. That collects data from projects and compares data, and you know, people were feeding. There's a name. I wish I could remember it. Anyway, and so we had hard data about the ongoing, how the project went and what the use uptake was when it got delivered to the customers and all those kinds of things. And we collected some other hard data. We posted all of that around the room. And it was a 2-day retrospective. So we started out by bringing everybody together. We did a couple of activities. We did a lot according to the retrospective that Norm describes in his book, because in his book, he describes a retrospective, and the retrospective facilitator is Diana Larsen. So I did the one in the book. So I was really familiar with his process for doing them. And he misspelled my name, but that's okay. So we had told people to bring artifacts from their work. And then as a part of the setting the stage, we had people show us what artifacts they had brought, like a pizza box from the night that they had to stay really late. And, you know, it was just all that somebody's diary or calendar about things. All kinds of things came. Some of them were metaphorical. And then we had a little contest where people voted on, had tickets to put in, and they voted on which of those artifacts they thought was most representative of the project, right? Or brought the project to mind for them the most. Well, so that was a setting the stage activity. It was kind of like a check-in, right? It was more robust than most check-ins that we do. But it got everybody's head thinking about letting go of, because they were all on to new work, right? So they had to let go of that and be back focused in that project. So they did that, and then we went around the room and we looked at all the data that we had collected. We talked about it. People asked questions about it, and then we did we did that mostly for the gathering data. We didn't try to do a lot of data gathering in the room. We may have had one other activity that we did. And then we moved into small group discussions. We actually did a form of 1, 2, 4 all called the creating a pyramid, which was, you know, people initially writing down things they wanted to remember from the project and carry forward, and then getting into small groups and talking about that, and deciding what things that they really wanted other people to know about, and they did a round of that, so that they bubbled up what they felt were the biggest issues that came out that from the contribution of all the data that we gathered. And then we had them work also again in small groups to come up with, given those issues, who wanted to work on different action items out of them. And they did that. I mean, this was happening, this, you know, as you can imagine, took hours. and we had an overnight. So we did all the data gathering, and we began the generating insights, and then that took us to the end of the day. We did a feedback session on how it was going so far to see if we needed to adjust anything for the next day. We fed people all day as well, and then they went away and they had a time to sleep on it. So when we came back the next day, we did just one more small insights thing. I don't remember what it was. And then we moved into choosing action items in the next morning when everybody was fresh. And so we generated a lot of different potential action items, and then processed them, and then figured out which ones they wanted to make the most focus on, figured out how that was going to happen. So that was a full day of not only identifying possible actions, but then picking the ones that would go forward, and then picking how they would take those forward in a way that was sustainable, who would take point on things to make sure that they kept moving forward. And then we ended the day with a feast. There was a big feast which was kind of the carrot to get people to stay for the whole time. The leaders, the group leaders, invited everybody to this feast, and so it ended on a really, you know, much lighter note. There was music, there was food, there was, you know, it was great. About 6 weeks later, well, between 6 weeks and 3 months or so later, I checked back in with the program manager and the product manager and all those folks. And I said, so what happened? Was there follow through? And I had told them that I would do that. And they said yes, that they had made some really important changes in how they put their projects together, how, you know, the kind of process and check-ins that they were doing. They had made about 6 really significant shifts in how they did their work. And so that felt great. So one of the things that we're going to talk about next is to think about it when you're doing enterprise. There's a bunch of things you need to think about in order to make some decisions about what group process activities are you going to use, what, oh, well, the other thing was when we did the interviews, we had it set up as appreciative inquiry interviews. So it was really about, you know, what was good about this, where did you find the most energy when you were part of this project, so that no one felt like we were all going to get together in the retrospective room and start blaming everybody. We had to set that tone right from the very beginning. I mean, right from even doing the pre-interviews that we did. We had to already be setting that tone that it was not going to be a blame and bash session. So that was an important piece of it too. So that's the story. And I've done a lot of other ones since. I mean, I've done a retrospective with our local utility here, with every single team in their IT department all coming together to do a retrospective on their, in that instance, they did a retrospective that the whole IT department moved from individual what I would call pre-agile, all individual contributors, aligned according to their functional, they're reporting to the quality, the test people all reported to the quality manager and so on. They took that entire department, which ended up being 17 teams, and turned them into teams, and then began instituting a more agile way of working there. And after they had been doing that for about 4 to 6 months, we had a big retrospective on how that shift was going. And that we held in a gym. Have you ever been to the Kennedy School in Portland, Ron? At all? It's an old elementary school that the McMinimans have turned into a McMinimans. And so one of the rooms you can rent there is the old school gym. And that's where we held this retrospective, was in the school gym. And but it was to look at how did that go? How did that transition go? And what did they want to keep doing going forward to solidify the benefits of that transition? So, that was a little more, Okay, thank you. Thank you, Gopal. Let me keep going here. I've just got a few more things to do. All right, play. All right, so the questions. How can we create more aliveness here? We did those. Let's move on. There we go. So the next part is really about how do you design a retrospective to fit the situation that you're looking at. Is it a huge retrospective, a whole lot of people? Is it only a few people, but they're all in senior leadership roles? All kinds of different things are going to affect the way you design the retrospective. And so here's some things that we want to consider. Is it going to be a co-located retrospective? Is it going to be remote and virtual? So setting, we really want to think about the setting. What else is going on in the context that we need to take into consideration? If it's a team, do you know their fluency zone? How long can you get for this retrospective? Now that they've all moved online, you may need to take much smaller, do them more frequently, smaller bites, because you're not going to be able to take as much time with each one. And then also duration in, well, there's another one there. What will the focus of this be? What are we looking to, what improvement are we going after? How complex is the situation that surrounds this? How complex was the work? Are we going to use the basic structure? Or are we going to use something else? How long a time did was the work that we're looking at? How big is the group? How much conflict and controversy was going on over the course of doing this? So once we have that in mind, we know, we've identified what group we're going to be working with. We can then describe the situation using those considerations, figure out what our improvement focus is, and then that tells us what kind of group process do we want to do to move through. And when we want to look at, initially, we want to sort of identify 1 or 2 activities per part of the 5. Then I look at that design, I review the 5 rules. How do I bring more aliveness? I ask my questions. I assess the flow. Does this activity move easily into the next activity I want to do? How are we going to sustain learning and improvement actions? Is it going to be a check-in 3 months later like I did with the Java 2E folks, or is there something else? I mean, that's when people know they're going to be checked up on, they tend to remember better than if they think you're just going to go away. And then, do I have all the facilitation skills I need for the activities I want to do? And if I don't, how do I get those? Or do I partner with someone? Do I need a co-facilitator, particularly if it's a really large retrospective? Probably you're going to need co-facilitators, at least one, maybe more. Because while you're doing explaining the next activity, you want somebody else sort of monitoring the energy of the group when it's a really big group. So you know, you figure out what's your plan, and it's helpful to have it reviewed by somebody else as well. So there are some additional, in addition to those, all those books that I gave you, there are a lot of online resources that have different kinds of activities that you can pull into a retrospective. Some of them are very software team focused. Others can be used for anything. So the RetroMat, Liberating Structures, Fun Retrospectives, Retrospectives Wiki, those are Tasty Cupcakes is another one. All great places to find activities that you can bring into a retrospective. There is a LinkedIn group for retrospectives if you want to join that and sort of be active there. There is the Agile Alliance has just started an initiative called the Principle 12 Initiative that is to support retrospectives going forward. There's a wonderful podcast called This is Retrospective Facilitation. If you want to listen to choices other people have been making, there's really a lot out there. These are just ones that were top of my mind. And then there are LeanPub books that come bundled. Some of them, I can't remember which ones for sure, all bundled together, but there's some that come in a bundle or you can buy them separately. These are, you know, all ebooks. And then from other publishers that you can get ebooks or hardbound books. Certainly, I recommend getting the Agile Retrospectives book and the Project Retrospectives book. I would get those two first if you don't have them. And then beyond that, I'd start picking among these other 6 that I have here. And then there are a lot more out there as well. But these are just some starter, your starter set of things you can look at. So thank you for inviting me. Please feel free to contact me. You can contact me at info@agilefluency.org. Or you can contact me through the Contact Us form on the agilefluency.org website if you've got more of a question. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. Yeah, I'm not going to say any more about that. And we're done with the slides. So let's talk about what other comments and questions that you may have.
Yeah, so if you have a question, just chat it or just open up your mic and ask away.
Let's just have some conversation. Yeah.
Diana, I have one. I was asking myself the whole time. Those retrospectives you do with them, with your clients, do you do them on a regular basis with them, or you intervene just punctually? And how long does it take?
Yes. Sometimes if it's a big thing like Java 2E, I only came into Sun that once. That they just really felt like it was super important. And actually they had gone to Norm Kurth first, but that was after he had had his accident. And so he was no longer able, and he suggested that they get in touch with me. So that huge one was the only one I did for them. The one I did with the IT department, I was with them for a couple of, like a year and a half. And I was doing small retrospectives, you know, teaching their Scrum Masters to do retrospectives, and doing some other things with them, some team chartering. And then we, you know, also did that big retrospective on how was the transition going. So it, you know, it happens in different ways, according to different needs for different organizations. You know, I'm not cheap, and so people generally don't want me hanging around too much. But yeah, I mean, you know, I show up wherever and whenever, and I can do, I still do retrospectives just for my own teams and things like that. So yeah.
The point behind my question was not to just know if you're there punctually,
Yeah.
but to understand the intention behind those formats, because I've never seen anybody put as much work, by far not as much work retrospective as you seem to do. So I was wondering, how long does each form of retrospective on average, or maybe you can give me a
well, yeah. So my thing is, I want the retrospectives that I do to lead to actual improvement and success. So I put a lot of time in them. I work with folks on how much. I have gotten to the place now where it generally takes me about the same amount of time to plan the retrospective as to lead the retrospective. In the beginning, and when people first begin doing this, I recommend that they plan 3 to 4 times the amount for the planning and design that they actually spend in the retrospective. Because it does take a lot of work. It is not a thing that you just knock off. I was at a client site. They had just brought me in, and they had a lot of teams, but they hadn't sort of fully. They were thinking in terms mostly of Scrum teams, and so they didn't have enough Scrum Masters to go around for every team. And so a lot of the teams had these combination product owner Scrum Masters. You may have run into this phenomenon yourself. And so at one point, I was going around just sitting with each team, observing while a retrospective went on. And so I went into this one retrospective that was being led by somebody who was a combo SMPO, and mostly PO with some SM duties, basically. And we all got in a room. The team were sitting around a conference table. They were absolutely slumped in their chairs. They all came in and they immediately went into this pose for the retrospective, right? And I watched the guy. He plugged in his computer. He popped up the Confluence page. He had already 2 columns set up for what went well, what do we want to do differently next time, or what didn't go well, and what do we want to do different. He had 3 columns. So they shouted out. He wrote in some lists. He said, okay, is there anybody that we want to give an appreciation to? Which I thought, well, that was nice, you know, he's doing that. And so they mentioned a couple of folks, somebody, product development person had given them some help or something. And then he was like, well, that's that's all that I have, and I really have some stories that I want to do some refining on, and so let's use the rest of our time to refine these stories. And I'm sitting there looking at these people who have hardly spoken. He almost said everything that got populated in those columns. There were maybe 2 other comments that came up, and I just couldn't stand it, and I said, I'm sorry, I know I'm supposed to be here as an observer, but could I just ask, are you going to take action on any of these things you just put up here? And he was like, oh, well, am I what? And all the team members set up and they said, yeah, if we don't start doing stuff about this, and if that doesn't change, we're not going to be. And they were all of a sudden energized, all of a sudden focused on the whole team outcome. All I had to say was, are we going to do any action here? Right? I didn't have to facilitate anything else. I didn't do one other thing. They figured it out, and among them they decided what improvement action they were going to take, and who was going to take point on it, and how that was going to, and they walked out of there. Right? You need all these pieces. You really do. You need, for people to think together, they have to learn together so that they're looking at the same body of data, and then they have to manipulate it. They have to analyze it together so that they share their understanding of it, and only then can they decide what action they want to take. And if they don't take any action, they're going to think retrospectives are a waste of time, and frankly they are, if no action comes out of them. I'm sorry, this is my rant. But I've just seen that sort of thing happen so many times. And even when Esther and I were writing the book way back in 2005, we had people coming up to us and saying, how can you possibly write a book about retrospectives? It's only 2 questions. or it's only 3 questions. And it's like, well, if you don't care, if you get any real improvement out of it, yeah, you can do a 2-question retrospective. But if you really want to get improvement, if you really want to have that group learning, that transfer of knowledge and so on moving forward, you have to go through all the steps. And if you want to just do the middle 3, just the gather data, generate insights, if you've got enough facilitation skills that you kind of naturally can know how to bring people in the room and you naturally know how to let them go, well, that's fine. But you've got to do those parts, because otherwise no learning happens. And if no learning happens, no improvement can happen. And if you don't, yeah, anyway.
And Diana, I can attest that working now at several companies and Scrum teams as well as Kanban teams, and not as much, to be honest with you, mob programming, I see retrospectives just being very lazy, and they're not being done well. Same thing with backlog refinement. Of the 2 things that are most important in the Scrum world, those 2 things to me are the most important things, and there needs to be a lot of improvement in our profession.
Right. Yeah. And yeah. Yeah, it's become kind of a project management. Let's make sure we're checking all the check boxes, and people have forgotten the why behind it, and so that it's really a shame. It's really a shame. So yeah, just going through the motions, absolutely, that happens an awful lot. An awful lot. So it's funny, we published our book in 2006, and it got a lot of uptake for a while, and now all of a sudden folks are coming back around and realizing we are not doing what we need to be doing here to get the outcomes that we want. And why is it that our Agile isn't successful? Right? Why aren't we getting the benefits from Agile that we thought we should get? Well, one of the reasons is you're not really forming teams who can learn and make things better together. And it's so critical.
And Diana, one of the things I'm trying to integrate too, it's still new, these OKRs that we're doing, and we have these OKR reviews. Well, we should do retros on the OKRs.
Yes.
And have action items, because I can guarantee you we're not going to meet most of the OKRs, okay? Yeah. So what are we going to do about it, right?
Right.
So anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, OKRs are a perfect example of an enterprise retrospective to do. Anything like that, any program initiative, any, anything. And when things happen that were unexpected, I mean, I heard from a number of people who said that one of the first things they did, good retrospective facilitators, one of the first thing they did when everybody was told to work from home was to hold a retrospective on, well, how have we been working together at work, and what of that do we want to make sure that we transfer to working remotely? And those folks made a much easier transition than a lot of other folks did. What do we want to preserve in the way that we have been working together? What do we let go of? What are the new opportunities that are being offered to us if we move into a remote way of working? So anytime there is some change, that's a great time for a retrospective. And change happens, surprising changes, unexpected things, VUCA, happens all the time at the enterprise level. So the other thing is that the reason that Esther and I call this a flexible framework is it doesn't always have to be a lot of work. As I described what I've overheard mob programming teams do, but also when Esther and I were writing the book together, we did it, we pair wrote. So we only wrote the book when we were sitting together. That's how I've written all my books. I only write books when I'm sitting with the co-author. And then at the end of each session, when Esther and I did it, we would visit each other's houses and we would stay for a few days, and so we could really get an intense writing session. And same thing when Ainsley Neese and I did the Liftoff book. We would go someplace together and have an intense writing session, and then go do the other things we need to do and come back. At the end of each of those, we would have a retrospective driving to the airport. So how did this week go for you? How did this week go for me? What stands out for us about this week? What did we notice happening this week that hasn't happened other times? How did we respond to that? What does that tell us about how we want to work next time? So is there something we really want to remember to change in the next time we get together? Yeah, okay, well let's make a note of that and make sure. And then when we get back together, what was that thing we were going to do this time? Oh, right, we were going to do this, right? 15 minutes. You can go through the whole five parts of the framework. So it doesn't always have to be this huge thing. But if you've got 75 people in a room and you're going to use 2 days of your time, you're not going to show up and just go, okay, guys, what do you want to talk about? You've got to have a plan for how you're going to use people's time in that situation. But it's pretty basic, just working it through. If you have ever seen the book, The Art of Focused Conversation, I didn't actually put that one here, but it's published. Brian Stanfield is the editor, and it was published by the Intercultural Institute or Intercultural Association in Canada. And it is basically those gather data, generate insights, decide what to do, question, or adaptive action. Only they say what, gut. So we put factual data and emotional data together in gather data. We said we want to do facts and feelings, right? But they separate them. So they say factual data, what actually happened that we can point to, that we know happened, and that, but not all of us may have seen. So we want to make sure we know, all of us know all the things that happened. How did we respond to that? What was our kind of gut level response? So what gut? So what? How do we interpret that? What insights do we get from that? How do we analyze that? Now what? What action are we going to take? And that Art of Focused Conversation book is a fabulous book for all kinds of different situations and different kinds of those questions you can ask. It's called ORID: Observation, Reflection, Interpretation, and Decision. But it's a very similar process. Observe, orient, what is it? The ODA loop. Oh, observe, orient, decide, act. It's the same. What you find this pattern showing up over and over again because it is what works when you need to do something together with folks.
So Diana, I have a question.
Sure.
Now with psychological safety, more important now with the Google results,
yeah,
and all that, are we starting to see more people opening up and being more emotional, talking about their behavior and their happiness factor and so forth in these retros?
Well, I'm not in everybody's retros, so I can't really say. I don't have that insight. I think it depends on if people are taking the time to create psychological safety in their retros. Then if they're taking the time to do that, and then during the work, they probably are. But one of the things that I really noticed, something that we heard a lot in the early days of retrospectives was, well, these are all software engineers. They don't deal with their feelings. They don't have emotions, right? They're all in their heads. So, we got to be careful. We can't be asking them how they feel about stuff, right? So, Esther and I took that under advisement, but I discovered, and she discovered, both of us did, that if we never use the word feelings, we got all kinds of stuff. So when the boss came in and said you were going to pivot to a different direction with this product, how did you all respond to that? Well, we got really pissed off, right? Or we got, you know, or when you had a chance to go visit the client site, what was that like, right? Wow, it was great to see them and could tell what they were doing, and I mean, engineers have just as many emotions as anybody else and feel, if anything, what I learned was they almost feel them more deeply, and in many cases might feel them more deeply. And so, and that may be why they shy away, right? Because it's significant to tap into that stuff. So I've always kind of just felt like that was bunk, that whole you can't do feelings with engineers, because it's good data. I mean, how you respond to something physically, emotionally is good data for your body is trying to tell you something. If you get a headache when you work on a particular area of the code or a particular part of the program, if you're a program administrator, every time you think about doing the certain spreadsheet, you just feel a headache coming on. That's information, right? That's information we need. And so, there's a whole realm of study now about somatics and work and so on. That's been it's known. And so, so I don't really shy away from that stuff. I also, as part of Keep It Alive, we didn't do so much of it here, but I've been incorporating more movement. Like, okay, now it's time for everybody to get up, walk around your chair, and sit back down. Now it's time to do hand dancing for a couple, for 45 seconds, and imagine, play whatever music you want in your head and let's do hand dancing. I mean, anything to kind of get people kind of engaged is important. I mean, that's part of the Keep It Alive. How can I do more of that? So yeah, it's a lot of, but those kinds of things also contribute to psychological safety, acknowledging that it's part of being human. It goes on, right? And getting people to the place where they can say that, for instance, when we were in that meeting the other day, I don't know if you noticed it or not, but I was trying to talk about this and you interrupted me about 4 times. And I kept losing my train of thought and it was really awkward. And I thought it was important information for the group. Could you stop? Could we work out something where you don't interrupt me so often? You got to have those kind of conversations. And that's where psychological safety comes from too. So once you can, once you're in the place where you're having those kind of conversations, you're getting there. Peer to peer. I'm not going to go to the boss and say, so-and-so keeps interrupting me in meetings. That's death to a team. I need to be able to tell you directly or whatever it might be. So, and retrospectives are one place to be able to do that. You also need to be able to do it outside the retrospective.
Diana, thank you for this whole day. I mean, my tail is just wagging at everything here.
Oh, that's great.
I'm in a new organization which has their own flavor and feel of retros, and it just hasn't been sitting right with me. It's psychosomatically I've been avoiding and putting it off and going through figuring out why. But in addition to figuring out why, with your presentation here, I've got a reminder of some of not just what's wrong with theirs, but what I'm looking for. So thank you.
All right. Oh, you're welcome. Well, and the recording will be available, so you can share it with your coworkers too.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah. Are we done?
Hey,
here's the other thing: you don't keep a meeting going longer than people want to be in it either. So just.
Right. I have one last one.
Victor had something. Yeah.
Hey, thanks a lot for all the insight. So when you talk about the enterprise retrospective, does it mean you have to do it all together in one place? Or have you experienced, because right now we are doing it virtually, right? And
Yeah.
also different geographic location. Have you experienced about, do it kind of separately and maybe even leadership level and the team level?
Yeah.
How does it work, for you?
Well, I mean, it depends on the focus, right? What people you want to pull together, what piece of work you're looking at. But years ago, do you know Monica Yap? I think she's down in the Bay Area now. Monica was working for a company in Seattle that also had locations that really were 24 hours. There were like 4 locations and they went right around the world. And she was doing retrospectives where they would do remotely because everybody was gone or elsewhere, where they would collect data all around the world. And then then they had that, and then the first group that it came back to would begin, oh, well, so how do we interpret this data? So they'd start adding in interpretations, and then people would add in interpretations all the way around the world, and then they'd move into, well, so what does this tell us about what we want to do? And they would do that all the way around the world. So there's lots of interesting ways to deal with this. If you have to be creative about it. A lot of folks are moving on to Miro and Mural, or there are some there's some good pay tools like Retrium is a good paid tool that bases itself mostly on the 5 phases of the retrospective framework. There are some other people are creating them. There's a lot more resources now for doing retrospectives remotely than there ever were before. That's over there, I guess. There are some books coming out on just facilitating meetings online, and a lot of those kinds of books and websites and so on, and a lot of those can be applied in retrospectives. You just have to make sure that the group process activity that you're choosing is one that is going to move you forward in the way you want to move forward. So you need to make sure you're, doing a data collection activity when you're wanting to collect data and so on. And like even the liberating structures, they almost all say, this helps you do X, Y, Z. And so that gives you some ideas about how to put those together. And people are starting to create sets of online liberating structure templates. So there's a lot out there now that you can build on to do remote retrospectives. The tricky bit is time and geography. Yeah. Yeah.
So I understand there is a tool like Miro or the other one that you talk about.
Yeah.
But kind of like, doing separately and then combine the information seems to be there are tricks because the focus might be different, right? If you ask this group and then they come back with the information, probably is kind of different, so it seems to be what you suggest, with the information coming back, you need to massage and then digest and then go out again and do the reiterate and then do another perspective on retrospective on the second. So but again, the efficiency, of course you can do that, but I just want to see whether do you have any experience about this kind of a situation.
Yeah, I mean, I do the same thing. I mean, I try to find a time when everybody can come and be available. If, depending on how much time I'm looking at, how much work time I'm looking at. So my guideline always was for like to really get a group of people to a place where they can go through, really do substantive thinking and learning and solid decision making so that everybody has buy-in. Really, about the least amount of time you can do that in is 75 minutes, co-located, which to me means 90 minutes online, right? So that's the minimum. If you really, and that's the other problem, that too many organizations say, oh, well, we'll give the retrospective half an hour. And it's like, no. A group of people cannot physically do that kind of thinking together and come to some consensus or at least collaboration forward in that length of time. It just doesn't happen. We do it internally. I think people think, oh, well, I can make a decision in, a split second. Well, yeah, but you're only working with yourself. When you got more brains and more voices, that adds time. So I start with about 75 minutes. And then as the length of time of the work that we're looking at gets longer, as it becomes more than, say, 5 to 7 people, that means more time, and so on. And so then if I start looking at a really big chunk of time because of some of those other complex factors, was it controversial? Was there a lot of conflict? That all adds more time. So then I start looking at how can I chunk it up, because people really can't be online that long in a meeting. So how can I do this part and then come back later and do the next part, and then come back later and do the next part. But in some ways, in those really big retrospectives that I've done before that were multi-day, we had to do that too. Had to figure out what would come in the first day and what would come in the second day. And I did some retrospectives that were 3 days long. So because they had so many people and just a lot of stuff to deal with. So anyway.
I'm going to put my Scrum Master hat on because time's up, everyone.
Time's up.
And I know that we could talk about this for much longer. So maybe Diana, is getting so busy, but maybe next year sometime you'll come back and visit us, and we can
we could do part 2. But then you'll have to tell me about the retrospectives you've been
doing. Right.
That's the deal.
Okay, fine.
Okay.
So thank you so much, Diana, for your time and your wisdom and sharing all your information. It was wonderful. Thank you, everyone on the call, for joining us. And next month we have we have more packed sessions coming. Some really cool stuff. So go to the Meetup site and sign up and come join us for the next sessions coming up. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah. And if you're an Agile coach or consultant, check out agilefluency.org.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Diana.
Bye.
Bye.